Good evening. Today's the first Sunday of Advent. This morning, as we celebrated our communion time, we also lit our first candle, the candle of prophecy. It's kind of hard sometimes, especially right now, for a lot of people to be excited about stuff because we do live in days of uncertainties, don't we? You see a lot of unrest, civil unrest. You see a lot of people just at their wits' end about all kinds of things. We have a contentious election, quarantines, isolation, et cetera, et cetera. The conditions of the world aren't the greatest they've ever been. And now we are here right now entering into a season of Advent, which represents light coming into darkness, anticipating the birth of Christ, who brought salvation to all men. It's God breaking into the world to breathe a a breath of fresh air into a contentious world. Now, certainly not in my lifetime have we needed such a light shining into darkness as we do right here in 2020. The Advent today marks the beginning of waiting, now not just sitting idly by, but waiting, doing something to prepare. It's a time of preparation for Christmas morning. Not a time of wrapping presents, not that kind of preparing, but it's a time to regain your spiritual acuteness, so to speak. A time to prepare your heart so the light can shine in. Now, right now, each day gets a little shorter. I don't know if you've noticing that or not, but uh, if you were to sit outside every day with your watch on and you were to mark the time when it gets dark and you can't see, anymore, you would notice that the days are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, the daylight hours. The days themselves are still 24 hours. I don't have to remind you of that. All the way up till December 22 or so, and then they'll start getting a little brighter after that. So not only is this a dark time, we're entering into the darkest times, sun-wise, of the year in our hemisphere, anyway, right here where we are. Uh, and I'm amazed that people have a hard time uh, comprehending a lot of times what's going on within their own lives when the absence of light is around. More depression, more suicides you see in the northern climes or so forth. You will notice that. But we need to remember that Advent was not a night of calm and bright like we sing about, but it was rather dark and hectic. There was no room for Mary in the hotels, no hospital where a baby could be born, no one celebrating with them, no family joining them for this birth, no sanitation, no white sheets, no baby warmer. Very little personal freedom existed even for Mary and Joseph. In fact, they were forced to go to Bethlehem because of the census. There was no option. He didn't get family leave. In fact, if they had met a soldier along the way, the soldier could have made them carry part of his clothing for a mile. Later, Jesus would talk about that, and he said, if someone forced you to carry their cloak for a mile, carry it too. In other words, live out the light within you. There was not much religious freedom, not much options on moving about freely like we think of that freedom. Not a night of bliss, not a time of no worries. The idea of the song Silent Night, Holy Night, that was not a thing for them because it was anything but that. The light of Christmas dawned upon a time of deep darkness. That's what the Bible tells us. The Bible says, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son. It was not the perfect time as mankind thinks about it. In fact, it was the worst of times. It was about to get so bad they could never recover. It was dismal. God chose that time to offer hope. In Luke 1, it says, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come, and he'll come to us from heaven. In Isaiah 9:2, Isaiah said, we read this morning, the people walking or dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the region of the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Now notice several things. They had to live in an area where it was completely dark. Now, the idea of darkness, we'll talk about in a little bit, is not just the time between sundown and sunup. And notice also that it said that they were in the region of the shadow of death. So there was no certainty of their lives. They lived in a time of gloom, threat of death around them for who they were. So I said darkness is not a biblical word which means sundown to sunup. No, darkness is an indication of the absence of the light of God. It represents not just the presence of sin, but the permeance of sin. The realm of Satan is always referred to in the Bible as darkness. Sin was rampant. It was in every area of influence in the world into which Jesus was born. The followers of God on this Advent season, when Jesus was born, were hammered by society. Now, that's true of a lot of the world today. If you read anything, you will see that when we look around at the world, there's the greatest time of persecution of Christians that we have seen in history worldwide. 20 countries are listed as danger for those who are believers. I hope that you're aware of the work that the Voice of the Martyrs does. We're all set right before Easter this past year to show the Voice of the Martyrs movie on Wormbrand, and then of course COVID came in. We'll still see that when everything is better. But in China, Christians are just put to death, imprisoned, relocated. In the Middle East, parts of Africa, parts of India, Indonesia, around the world, darkness is permeating again. Persecution of Christians is on the rise. In China, the persecution of all religious groups is on the rise. After all, the true implication of communism is the absence of all religion. And so you have to stamp that out. What was it that Marx said? Religion is the opiate of the people. What did he mean by that? Religion gives them hope. Religion will help them in the midst of the horrible conditions of life, and they will not live in despair, and it's hard to control those who have faith. So on that Christmas morning, Jesus wasn't born into a world that was already filled with light. He was born into a world filled with darkness, war, turmoil. The hope of those followers of God had all but gone out. You can see from all the events of Jesus' life, even the religious leaders were filled with sin, and their actions were very sinful. So Jesus was the light coming into the world to show people what light really is. The angels gave the words, good news of great joy. They needed good news. They needed the message Jesus brought. Good news, salvation. Good news, the light of God. Good news, the words that Christ would bring. In 1 John 5, John tells us the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot put it out. See, the message of light being lived out before his own people was virtually rejected by his own people. So Jesus was spreading the words of light into a world that was so filled with darkness that they thought darkness was normal and light was abnormal. They thought darkness was truth and the light of truth was wrong. Jesus said the people loved the darkness because their deeds were evil. The followers were reminded that if you follow Jesus, you'll not walk in darkness, but you'll have the light of life. Now, I know what must have gone through their minds. Wow, we have the light of life, but all around us, people enjoy the darkness. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 5? You don't light a light and put it under a bushel. The metaphor for that is you don't become a follower and then not tell anybody. You don't become a follower of Christ and then live like the world lives. You have the light of life. On the day that Jesus died, it seemed like darkness had won, didn't it? Listen to these metaphors. Judas went out to betray Jesus when? In the dark. Peter denied Jesus in the darkness. The disciples ran away in the dark. And when Jesus was on the cross, the Bible tells us that the world became dark, the sun refused to shine. It was not the end of light, but it was a pronouncement on the end of darkness, because the light won. The light was about to become permanent, eternal in the world. So on resurrection morning, on Sunday morning, the light shone brightly. It'll never be put out. It was the power over darkness, the power over sin. That's why Paul says in Romans 8, death has no sting. Why? Because the light has taken it away. No matter how dark it may seem, it'll never be dark. On Bethlehem morning, before Jesus was born, it was dark. And in the darkness of night, the dawn was just around the corner. It's always its coldest just before the sun comes up. It's always its darkest just before the sun comes up. That's the way it was on the morning Jesus was born. And each of us, before Christ came into our lives, we were in darkness, but Paul tells us we were transferred from the realm of darkness into the realm of light. We became adopted as sons, you and I, no longer children of the night. Now, if we choose, we will see only darkness if we look away from the light. So we can take this time of Advent, the season of Advent, and not even reflect on the acuteness of our faith, our growing, our preparation for the birth of Christ. We could actually focus on the worldly things of the dangers of this world and miss out on the blessings of Advent. Isn't it amazing? No amount of persecution, no amount of anti-religious laws, no amount of turmoil in this world can put the light out. Nothing can put out the light of Christ in people. I read an interesting report. I get the Voice of the Martyrs and different things on religions in the world. It said when Vietnam fell, there were roughly 50,000 Christians in Vietnam. I'd met a missionary one time who was a missionary in Vietnam during the time of the war. And of course, he had to leave with the fall of Saigon. 50,000. Today, millions of believers. When communism took over Vietnam, they were going to stamp it out. The end of all faith. Well, what happened? The light shone brighter. Because where darkness tries to become powerful, the light will supersede it every time. See, the Advent never says that darkness is absent. The Advent says we confront darkness head on. We conquer darkness, one person at a time. because they see the strength of those with light in the midst of dark days. And no amount of darkness will ever stop the light of one small candle. Years ago, I used to backpack, and I remember back before I ever wanted to carry a flashlight, I carried a candle lantern. And it was about maybe 3.5 inches tall. And back then, it had glass around it, and the bottom came off, and you put one of those little teacup candles in it, and you screwed it back on. You could hang it in your tent. And I remember when I bought it, it was in a store, and the lights were on, and I was thinking, this thing won't work. So I tried it. I went out in the middle of the darkness, lit the little teacup candle, put it in there, and hung it on a little bush and sat down. And I was amazed. It was so bright I could read by it. And so for years I carried that little old lantern. Then one day I wised up and I got a flashlight with 2 AA batteries. And now, wow, you can have lights to carry into the darkness. Let those be an indicative of your faith. If you want to let darkness rule your life, all you have to do is have the absence of life in your life. But where there's a little bit of light of Christ, the darkness will never take over. So darkness really is the absence of light. It doesn't reflect anything. The light of your life is a reflection of the light within you of Christ. So all the stars you see at night, what are they reflecting? The light off the sun, the light off other stars and planets. See, the moon in and of itself has no light. It's a mere reflection of the light of the sun. That's why it's in stages. That's why it's not always full. It's not its own light. You're not your own light. This Advent, prepare for the light of the world. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you that tonight, as we ponder the Advent season, as we remember the light of the candle of prophecy, that the light within us can never be put out by darkness. Help us to live in the light that we have from you. Help our lights to shine brightly. Help these weeks leading up to Christmas to be a preparation spiritually for us, to be ready for the implications of what it means to be a believer. For we pray in your name. Amen. Good night. Have a great night. Enjoy this week.